Sorry to start the day off with a joke like that, though. Uh-oh, what happened? I think I'm good. So today we've got our bulb back. Yay, team! I called IT yesterday or Monday, and they emailed me and said we checked it and it looked fine. I was like, oh crap, they didn't fix it. Well, but they did. I don't know what they did. In any case, sorry you didn't get to see any videos and things of Nietzsche, because, gosh, some of that stuff is really cool. So I highly recommend at least looking at Bethany Yu's video on Friedrich Nietzsche. She shows you his house as a kid, his the little hotel up in the mountains where he wrote Thus Spake Zarathustra, at least the first half of it, and so on. Lots of really neat stuff. Plus the Wagner stuff, that's pretty fascinating too. I think three of you Monday said that you had heard of Wagner. I don't know if you're a fan or not. It almost feels wrong to be a fan of Wagner because Wagner was so anti-Semitic. And the connection, of course, with the Nazis still today, because if you go to, I mentioned, if you go to the festivals today, my one friend went to the one in Seattle and he said that the whole place was full of Nazis. So American Nazis, though, so it's kind of a different thing. Is it? I don't know. In any case, sorry about not having stuff to show you, but the bulb's working, and so I've got a whole bunch of folks I can mention today. There's, of course, lots and lots of stuff on American pragmatists. What's the difference? My quiz question is, what's the difference between utilitarianism and pragmatism? It's one of those questions where there's no real right answer. It's just your opinion by comparison. And utility is still, of course, a philosophy in England that all of England really uses. And pragmatism is associated with the United States. I mean, you can see pragmatism associated with Germany, especially. And an easy reason for that is after World War II, Germany was occupied by Americans, and so all the young Germans going to school basically learned to grow up being as American as they could. And so actually pragmatism became pretty much the main philosophy of that generation of German philosophers. Perfect example, I should have put him up here as well, even though he's German. He's really a pragmatist. Jürgen Habermas. Throw up his Wikipedia page. And point out that his focus is on language, critical theory, pragmatism. So if you hear of him, he is difficult. A lot of the contemporary pragmatists are quite difficult. Part of it is because of the nature of the logic that they look at when they're working with it. But let's go to, I suppose the one easy source to think about it is the Metaphysical Club. That's what the group of them at Harvard referred to themselves as, the Metaphysical Club. And it's also the title of a book by Louis Menand. So, point out, because it's an eminently readable book that really explains a lot about philosophy in the United States. And it won an award. I don't see it here, but somewhere it ought to say that it won. Oh, there it is. It won a Pulitzer. And Louis Menand is a great author. He's written other things as well, but all of which I'd recommend, actually, because he's one of those authors that not only gives you a biography of an individual, but it's a intellectual biography of that person. So it gives you an explanation of the kinds of thoughts they had, the works that they wrote, who influenced them, the interrelationships they had, and so on. So the Metaphysical Club gives you kind of an interesting insight into four specific Americans. Charles Sanders Peirce, we'll discuss today. William James, which, how many folks have heard of William James before? Few folks. His most famous book, which you probably, I'm pretty sure you could find it in Barnes and Nobles, is getting Josiah Royce and him. William James's book is The Varieties of Religious. Wow, I'm getting old. Where's my James? This is here. So The Varieties of the Religious Experience. There we go. I notice I didn't find it yet. My mind actually worked slightly slow, but there it was. Different forms of religious experience, and that's The Varieties of Religious Experience. And that was written for his Edmund. He gave the lectures in Edinburgh, so that was a significant invitation, considered to be the first time an American philosopher was invited to give those lectures in Europe, in Edinburgh. But either the year before, or it must have been the year after, Josiah Royce, who was his neighbor in Harvard, lived right next to one another. Josiah Royce, another American philosopher, a homegrown American philosopher. William James is homegrown, Charles Sanders Peirce is homegrown, but Josiah Royce was not only homegrown but also home educated. The others were educated really by European influences. James, especially William James' father, was very rich, and as a result wanted the best education for his children, and so he took them to Europe and took them to different schools where he enrolled them. He heard this school was great, so he enrolled his kids in that school. After about a month, he was like, nah, it's not really that good. So he took them out and he tried another school, and then they tried another school. So they're hopscotching all over Europe, going to all these different schools in order to try to educate their children. You have an odd situation. But Charles Sanders Peirce is the first one that we consider to be an American pragmatist. And his father was a professor at Harvard who taught mathematics, if I'm remembering correctly. And the interesting thing about his father, besides teaching him as much as he could, I suppose, about mathematics, getting him interested in things like measuring the speed of light. Even today, I'm not sure how you measure the speed of light. I'm still confused about the speed of dark, right? You know, how fast is the speed of dark? That's a joke. Okay. In case you've never heard that one before, what's the speed of dark? But during the Civil War, the father was in charge of the United States Geodetic Survey team, which had as their primary task mapping the area around Washington, D.C., so that the military could set up defenses in case the Confederates came to attack Washington, D.C. So he assisted his father in working on that mapping project. Besides that, he also worked in the lab trying to measure the speed of light. And he also was interested in philosophy and ended up studying philosophy, especially logic. So what is kind of the main point of Louis Menon's The Metaphysical Club, talking about, there they are, Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, John Dewey, who we will discuss next class, Monday, and George Herbert Mead, who I never cover for some reason. But I'll read this paragraph from the book. American outburst. During the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there was an outburst and flourishing of philosophic activity in America. The key figures drew upon a variety of European orientations, British empiricism, Kant, Hegel, but an important group emerged which included Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, John Dewey, and George Herbert Mead. Although there were sharp differences in their intellectual backgrounds, philosophic temperaments, training, and interests, nevertheless, there were also sufficient family resemblances so that they, as well as others, began to think of themselves as constituting a distinctive philosophic movement. William James, a gifted stylist and an immensely popular lecturer, labeled the movement pragmatism and acknowledged Peirce as its founder. Sometimes it is said that pragmatism was born from James's misunderstanding of Peirce. Peirce was so outraged, not really, by James's popularization that he renamed his own doctrine pragmaticism, a name ugly enough to be safe from kidnappers. They were actually good friends. In fact, Peirce, being a drunk and not having employment, basically survived because William James funded him. How did Peirce ended up being a drunk? Well, he got fired. Why did he get fired? He was teaching logic at Johns Hopkins University, a new university. And by the way, one of his students, not actually in his class, but one that was interested in his lectures, was John Dewey. So there is an actual physical connection between these early American philosophers in the sense of knowing one another personally. But he dated a French woman who was a divorcee. And at the time, that was like, ooh la la. I mean, oh no, taboo, basically, right? You know, not allowed to do that. And so he was fired for dating a divorcee. And in fact, even though he married her eventually, and they lived happily ever after in Pennsylvania, the firing basically kept him not only from teaching at Johns Hopkins anymore, but from anywhere else, because it ruined his career. And so he didn't have any employment other than his own writings, which didn't really pay. It's not the kind of profession that would pay you anything then. But so what does pragmatism mean? The word comes from a Greek, which means pragma, that which has been done. A comparison would be in Latin where they say res, a thing, like the res cogitans, for example, of Descartes, the thinking thing. Kant also used pragmatism. In fact, one of his books was an anthropological pragmatism. And he used pragmatism as a relation to some definite human purpose. And that's a real key to what we think of as pragmatism. When we think of American philosophy, it's the American common sense. And you might think, well, if you've grown up in the United States, well, that's just normal thinking. Well, part of what I should have been trying to impart throughout the course is that the philosophies we've looked at in all the other venues were really important to the way people thought. And our common sense way of thinking is actually unique to the United States. It has overlapping kinds of similarities with England. The utilitarian philosophy is somewhat similar. But America is really a really unique country. And not just, in the sense that worldwide people would like to come here, no matter what some Americans think of the place. Worldwide, it seems very attractive to people. And when you get here and you see how things work and function, and it's absolutely amazing, and I'm not just talking about Epcot or Disney World, but even streets in like New York and Philadelphia, San Francisco, urban environments, it's actually amazing compared. Have you ever seen the traffic in India?
You ever driven in Paris?
No.
Italy's
No.
much better. Italy's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it is. I'm a little with
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
I've driven in Germany, and you
That's
know,
a good example.
I thought, you know, there were traffic circles there, and you know, I learned all you have to do is get your car into the circle and close your eyes, and you squirt out someplace, you know, and it's kind of cool. Of course, I had an old Volvo. Wasn't that old, but I had an old Volvo when I was driving there, and 4-cylinder engine, made in Sweden. Windows were shot out twice, oddly, not while I was in it, but while I was parked at the housing area. And I was stationed in Berlin, and the windows were shut out twice, and both times I thought, well, that should be easy to fix. After all, it's a Swedish car. Turns out that it was made for America, and so the windows had to be ordered and brought from Sweden to America to Germany. So none of those took place very quickly. It was always an ordeal to get them replaced. However, when I would be on the Autobahn, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, in Germany there's no speed limit on the Autobahn. And if you have a BMW and you're driving as fast as you'd like to, and you're in the left-hand lane, and I'm in the other lane, if I look in my rear view mirror and I see no cars coming, by the time I might turn on my signal and move to the left lane, there's a BMW coming right down my rear bumper. It's that fast. So be careful if you're driving. I don't know if conditions have changed or
Well,
not.
they're much more courteous now. I was there, and I left in 2015, and if you flash your lights, that's like a general courtesy that like, hey, you need to move over, and people do. So like, if you're coming up behind someone in the left lane, you just flash your lights, and then move over, and it's like not a big deal, and it happens like consistent. They will move over, unless they're like a trucker, and then they'll just do whatever they want.
Yeah, well, it's bad news if they don't, because at the speeds they travel, there's no injuries as a result of accidents.
Usually fatalities.
It's fatalities, yeah. How did I get there? I don't know how I got to that. But it's very practical, and I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the normal, commonsensical way people in the United States think and act is significantly different, and I would argue that it's a philosophical difference. And that is philosophically, of course, associated with pragmatism as a philosophy of this country from these folks on. This was not common sense, but they made it common sense. And so what we've got is a clear example of how philosophy changes the way people think in a country. And how does that work? You know, so for Peirce, the main concern about knowledge in general is how it's related to action, to practical, pragmatic activity. And for him, the foundation of pragmatism was what he called a behavioral semiotic. Semiotic is the theory of meaning, and behavioral is, of course, how we behave. And the idea was that you could figure out what words meant in practice by looking at how people behaved along with how they uttered what they uttered, right? So in a sense, when people started going to investigate languages that they didn't understand by going to those places, I think of Everett in his book, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. So this, in this particular book, for example, Everett goes to a Amazonian village where, I mean, they've not even seen really people other than from their own community. And he goes there, and the people are known as the Piraha. And he goes there and tries to learn their language, not only to be able to communicate with them and to understand the language, but also to convert them. He was a Christian missionary at the time. And so he thought, what he could do is convert them. And if you study the methods by which he's, basically trying to, step by step learn what words mean in association with what they're actually doing and so on. It led to all kinds of interesting things. He, at least, I think by the time he wrote the book, had been there 25 years with his family. So he brought his family, raised his kids in this jungle environment where the title is "Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes." It's because if you're asleep at night, snakes come in and they like getting into your bed with you because you're warm and so on. And so you really have to stay awake while you're sleeping. That's the... That doesn't make sense, but nonetheless, that's the deal. You're not safe if you're asleep, so you have to kind of keep one eye open, I suppose. But so he goes through the process and explaining it in this book to show how the language works, and it involved an interesting dilemma, because at the time, as a linguist, his one of his influences was Noam Chomsky, who I've mentioned briefly occasionally. I think I've even shown you a page on him, right? Chomsky, let's go this way. Some of his not quite friends refer to him as Nim Chimpsky, but Noam Chomsky. And the interesting thing here is that Chomsky is famous for the idea that all human languages have a common structure to them, almost like Kant. In Kant, trying to argue that the reason that our experience, or the phenomena, all seem so similar, that humans have a shared social environment, is because of the way the mind structures that experience. As he will argue, that all human languages have a basic structure, a universal structure that is in common. Well, what Everett found in the Piraha was cases where they certainly did not have that same kind of universal structure that Chomsky was arguing for. And by the way, they still argue over whether or not human languages all share a basic deep grammar.
They were a lingua isolate, right? They were isolated.
They were.
As opposed to like being a Proto-Indo-European language, which is
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But,
Yeah,
no,
they're
Chomsky
completely
argues
isolated. I imagine, thanks to him, they're not any longer.
Sure.
But I imagine there are still pockets of such villages in Brazil and other
Well,
places.
there's European languages too that are lingua isolates. Like I don't know if it's
Like Basque.
what is it?
Basque
The
language.
Basque is not
They're still
even
sketching
considered
it.
European, actually.
Well, it's not Semitic either, but then it's also not Proto-Indo-European, right? So it's like there's this weird.
Yeah, it's
which is very unusual.
kind of
literary.
Denisovan. It's pre-Homo sapiens almost, and so it's not just the language. It could be that the people, from what I understand, might have kind of a different genetic, because they're isolated on purpose. They didn't want to be fooled with by the French or the Spanish or the Moors, etc. But the point I wanted to make, though, is that his approach to understanding and trying to learn the language comes from a behavioral semiotic. You kind of sit there with a notebook and you see what they do and what they say, and you line the two things up, kind of like a chart, so that you're basically associating this inflection with this kind of activity, and so on. And that's what Charles Sanders Peirce is trying to do. Is trying to understand the semiotic, a theory of signs. A word's meaning is its use, how it's used in a particular situation. Now, obviously we're going to discover that there's quite a range of uses of words. And so a big problem for a pragmatist is coming to conclude that there is no such thing as meaning per se. It's instead the use that we put things to, and it's a dialectical process of how words are accepted and used in society, so that as we're talking with one another, we're constantly looking at feedback from the others that we're talking with to see if they get what we're saying. Are they understanding what we're talking about? And we can get that sense from, whether they laugh at our lousy joke about the hairspray or, whatever, right? We're constantly getting feedback. Remember Hegel's dictum that I am as I see others see me. So my sense of self is totally social. It's dependent on how others see me. And so is my correct use of language. I'm constantly needing feedback in order to know if I'm expressing things the way I intended, so that you ended up getting a meaning. A favorite example of how this works out in practice, in my mind at least, is the jury. And I'm not thinking just of Trump sitting there, today. Sorry, I didn't mean to hurt your shoulder with that line.
Oh, no.
That was,
That's why I'm in town for.
shouldn't say Trump. That's damaging to some folks. But I mean, Trump is okay. Let me use Trump as an example. He's forever saying this is totally wrong. This is totally, political, et cetera, et cetera. And other people are saying, well, no, you broke the law. And you get the sense that he's using language in a way that's totally contrary to the opponents and the way they're expressing themselves. You're breaking the law, and he's like, no, you can, if you're rich, you're allowed to grab them by the, thing. There's bad things that he says that he feels like, well, it's perfectly acceptable considering who he is. And everyone else is trying to tell him, no, that's not acceptable, ever, by anybody, let alone, somebody like you. He's not kind of functioning and understanding the feedback that he ought to have been getting all along from other people. It's a dialectical process. And if you think about it, when we go and look at dictionaries and say, what does mule mean? And we go and we look up, and I don't know why I picked that one, but you just go to the dictionary, the OED or whatever, and you look up what mule means. We could go to, well, this should be fun. Let's go to Urban, did I spell it right? Urban Dictionary, and look up, I don't know what that is. Let's search. I'll search for, what am I not doing right here? Search. I'm in it already. Okay, so mule. And there we go. Carrier of things for someone else. Often you et cetera, et cetera. A pack of mules, a drug mule, government mule, beat it like a rented mule. This is just, what the heck are all these? Looping the mule, burn a mule. As you can see, there's a constant flow of new ideas that are associated with how, in practice, people use a word. dictionaries in a sense are, well, they're interesting, but the real way you learn how to use a word is in practice. We don't actually sit down and learn vocabulary as children. We immerse ourselves. And I mentioned, first day, the best education experience I've ever had was when I was in the Language Institute in Monterey, California, where I was immersed basically in Russian for 52 weeks. And that was absolutely amazing. It gives some people headaches the first couple of weeks, because basically you're being dropped into a foreign language. It's different in the Institute, though, a little bit, because you get a grammar class. Grammar class is traditionally taught in the language that you're coming from, so that you can understand how the grammar works. So you get some reprieve during the day, of course. But the idea is immersion, and I've tried to suggest that an Intro to Philosophy course is trying to teach you philosophy speak, so that you can become at least somewhat fluent in philosophy vocabulary and how it's used and so on. And by the way, there's tons of folks that use this constantly out there, so that if you're going to be aware of those kinds of conversations, you really have to have this kind of background in this kind of vocabulary in order to understand what's going on, the kinds of thinking that people are using in order to figure out